Hello everyone, let's say you have this setup on Azure, and this is exactly the setup that we have deployed using Terraform in my last video of the series. Now, to deploy a complete application, in addition to these services, we need other Azure PaaS services like Azure databases, storage accounts, and things like that. And in this video, my focus is to show you how you can integrate with other Azure PaaS services securely into a setup like this. Now, let's say you want to deploy a Azure SQL database. Now, let me add a SQL server. Now we can introduce a database like this, and we can, let me add an arrow here. All right. Application can talk to the database. Now, the problem with this approach is that this database sits outside of the virtual network, right? And this has a publicly accessible endpoint that anyone can access, so that is not secure. And the traffic that goes from this app service into this database, it is going over the public internet. And this is not secure enough when we work with services like App Service Environments, because we're using App Service Environments to achieve highest possible security. In situations like this, what can we do? Can we just create another subnet? Let's say, so can we create a subnet like this, add the database and, connect the service into this database? Is this an option? Well, now this is the service called Azure Private Link comes in. Now, if you look at this service, what this feature in Azure, what it does is that this enables you to access Azure PaaS services, for example, Azure Storage, Azure SQL Database, or a private connection. So if we can properly integrate Azure Private Link into this, we can achieve the setup that we want. But we can't directly put the database, right? The database into the subnet. What we can do is we can create something called a private endpoint. All right, now I'm going to add a private endpoint, right? Connection here like this. Let me call it PE SQL connection. What we now can do is this app service, this can talk to the private endpoint connection like this. The app directly talk to the SQL private endpoint, and the private endpoint maintains a secure connection through something called Microsoft Backbone Network. So this connection is secure because the traffic goes through Microsoft Backbone Network, and this connection here, it is within the virtual network. So now we have established a secure connection from the app service into the Azure SQL database. So as I told you earlier, we can't directly initiate a connection from this to the database, and this is how we should do it to make it secure. Now, a few things that you should keep in mind is that for this resource here, you have to pay extra, and there will be a direct IP address created within this virtual network for this Azure SQL database. Let me show you one more thing. And if you go into Azure Reference Architectures, this section of Azure Architecture Center contains a lot of architecture that we can get ideas from. And if you search for App Service Environments, right, and if you go into the first architecture that they have here and scroll down, as you can see, they basically have the same setup we have. We have the a virtual machine in one subnet, and the app service environment in another subnet, and we have a few more subnets here. Now, if you focus on this subnet here, the name of it is Private Endpoints, and we have Azure Service Bus, Cosmos DB, SQL Server, Azure Key Vault. All of these are connected to this environment or this virtual network using private endpoints. Now, if I go back to architecture, and one more thing that you should do is that you can't directly call that IP address and access this service. For this also, you need another DNS zone. And if we go back to the architecture that I've shown here, they have also implemented DNS zones. The reason is that you can't directly talk to these services through the IP address. You need to talk to them using the actual domain name, private endpoint. So now we have two private DNS zone in our setup. We have the private DNS zone to access the app service environments or the apps in the app service environment, and we need another private DNS zone so that the apps can talk to the Azure SQL database securely. And now let me go into Azure portal, and if you search for private link, we have this section here called Private Link Center, and here you can manage the private link connections. Azure Private Link is a secure and scalable way to create, share, and connect to Azure. all data that flows from a provider to a consumer is isolated from the internet and stays on Microsoft backend. Now, if you look at this, we have pending connections, private endpoints, and private link services. If you go back to the diagram, I told you that this is a private link resource and this is a private endpoint. You can create, for example, your own services. Like let's say you have an app that exposes a say the weather API or something like that, right? You can create, in addition to these existing services, you can sell your API using a private link connection to other providers, and that is why we have these pending connections, and you can create connections and others can approve it. And this is the private link services, and this is, for example, a private link service. And let me just add these namings as well. This is a private link service, right? And this is a private link resource, and this is a private endpoint, right? And this, the whole feature is called Azure Private Link. Now I hope you have an idea of these private endpoints and private link resources and private link services and the whole thing that is going on. I hope you have an overall idea of this setup. And now, since we had already this setup here, the virtual machine and this app service deployed, let me show you how to create a Azure SQL database and a private endpoint connection within this environment, and then deploy a sample application, and I'm going to show you how it works. Now let me go back to the Azure portal and go into that resource group that we have created earlier. I'm in that resource group, and let's implement the setup that I had in the diagram here. So the first thing that we need to do is creating a subnet in the virtual network. Now I'm in that virtual network, and if I go into subnets, and I can just create a subnet here. I'm going to call it PE subnet, and the address space is, I'm going to call it, so this would be the address space of this private endpoint subnet. I'm gonna create it without modifying anything here. Now that we have the subnet in place, the next thing that we should do is creating the Azure SQL database. And if we go into this resource group, and if we go into create, and I'm gonna search for Azure SQL database, all right, and I'm gonna go ahead and create it, all right. The database, I'm gonna call it catalogdb, something like this, and we'll have to create a server as well, all right. And then I'm gonna add, all right, I have created the server, and the database, I want to create a serverless database here. If I go into the networking section here, network connectivity, we have three methods. We have no access, we have public endpoint, right? Now usually this is how we deploy applications, so that we can access the database from a public endpoint, but now we want to deploy it in a more secure way. Now when you select the private endpoint option, we can just add a private endpoint right here in this DB creation wizard itself. I'm going to click this button to create the private endpoint. Now if I go into the architecture here, what is happening is that we tried to create this Azure SQL database, and in the process they're giving us the option to create this private endpoint connection as well. Now let me go back. I'm going to change the location to West Europe. All right, and then I can select the virtual network, and I can select the private endpoint subnet as well. So this private endpoint will be created within this subnet here, private endpoint subnet, and that's what I have done there. And we can name it, something like that. All right, as I told you earlier, we had to, in addition to this private endpoint, to make this completely work or make this complete, we need a private DNS zone created as well. And that is why they're asking it here, do you want to integrate a private DNS zone as well? I'm going to go with yes. And we could have created the database without a private endpoint or a private DNS zone, and we could have manually created these services, but we don't have. They're just giving us the options in the database creation itself. All right, now we have configured everything, and then I'm going to go ahead and create this database. As you can see, the database is now in place. If I try to connect to it, let me just copy this server name, and I'm going to go into the SQL Server Management Studio from my local computer, and then from the virtual machine that we have here within this environment. I'm going to show you whether the database is accessible from my computer or not. Let me just go back, and if I try to connect it from my local computer, Yeah, as you can see, I cannot access the server. And now if I log into the virtual machine, and now I'm in that virtual machine, and let me enter the password. If I try connecting to it, as you can see, the connection works seamlessly. What I wanted to show you is that now I'm connecting to this database from this virtual machine through this private endpoint connection. Now let me prove this to you. I'm going to go into the command line and let's see. All right, let's try to do an NS lookup of the server here. Let me just go back and paste it here. As you can see, we are connecting to a private address from this virtual machine. Even though we are the domain name of it, we are actually connecting to the private endpoint of this SQL Server database. Now we have completed this setup. Now I have shown you how to access this database securely from within this environment of this virtual network. And now to complete this demo, I'm going to deploy an application into this app service environment, and then I'm going to show you how that app works connecting with this Azure SQL database. For this, I'm going to have to create a Azure container registry and push an image to that. So let me go back into this resource group and create a container registry. All right, the container registry is in place. I'm going to push an image to this container registry. Image, right, this image here. I have this in my local computer, and I'm going to push this into Docker registry that we have just created. I want to AC demo. All right, container registry. And the next thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to tag the image with the new tag name of this container registry. All right, and the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to push that image to the container registry that we have just created. All right, I think I have made a mistake here. It's not Azure ACR, it's Azure CR. And then let me try push this again. Now I have pushed the image that I had in my computer to the container registry. And if you want to use this image for trying some stuff out, this is available in Docker Hub. And let me just go back to the Azure portal. And if I go into the repositories, as you can see, we have the image. And now let me go back to the resource group and try to deploy the application. I'm just going to create a new web app, right? Call it web app, and then create it. I want to call it eShop. I'm going to select the environment and I'm going to go with a Docker container, right? This is the app service plan and it's all good. I'm going to go ahead and go into the Docker configuration, and we are deploying a single container, and the image source is Azure Container Registry, and I'm selecting that AC demo registry. And to do this, we have to do one thing, and that is enabling the admin access. I'm going to go into that container registry, and then I'm going to go into access keys and enable admin user. All right, and now if I select this option and AC demo, now as you can see, it can list the images of that container registry. And then I'm going to go ahead and deploy this web app. Now I have deployed this web app here, and if we go into the deployment center and the logs section, and here as you can see, we have in the settings section, as you can see, we have the configurations that we have done already there. And if we go into this section here, attempting to pull the image, this seems like a success. But for this image to work, I'm going to add few configurations. I'm going to connect to this database using the connection string, and that is not the best way to connect. I'm going to show you how to connect using managed identity in one of my upcoming videos. But for now, I'm going to add few configurations here. This app that I'm deploying, it is a public ASP.NET demo. Let me show you that as well. And I have taken this from this repository and I have containerized this and deployed into Docker Hub, and that is what I have done. And to make this application work, we need to have two databases. In addition to the one database that I have created earlier, now let me create another database and then add the connection strings into the app service that I have deployed here. And let me just go into the database server and create a new database. I want to call it identity DB. Now we have the new database as well. We have two databases in this server that we have created. And now let me go back to this eshop-web app that we have deployed and configuration. And I'm going to add the connection strings of the databases. Alright, I have added three settings here: the environment, catalog context, and the identity DB context in this web app. And let's try to see whether this app works. And let me just copy this domain and go into the virtual machine and open up Chrome browser. And alright, as you can see, the app works. And let me see whether I can log into it and register as a new user. I want to call it an@gmail.com. Alright, okay, now I have registered as a new user, and let's see whether we are connecting to the right databases. And if we go into this identity DB, and as you can see in the database, we have the new user. So this database connection works. And what we have basically done is, let me just rename this to eShop. Alright, now we have deployed this eShop sample application into the setup, and the connection is now going through this private endpoint connection. And one more interesting thing that I wanted to show you is that if I go into the resource group, the region of this virtual network, and that is in West Europe region, but the database server, that is in East US region. And what I want to show you is that this private link connection that we have here is in West US region. The database is in East US region. So these are in different countries, different regions. Even though they're in different regions, these connections, they seamlessly work. This is something also that I wanted to showcase in this video, and that's why I created the database in a different region. Now this is what I wanted to show you in this video. If you have any video suggestions to this series of videos on Azure App Service Environment, let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you learned something new today. I will see you with another video soon, and thanks for watching.